See, just like multi-factor approach which we have used for hedging, wherein we tried finding out the key rates and durations at each of the layers and mapped each of the buckets with with the corresponding hedging instrument and trying to see how the risk can be eliminated across, not only at that overall. But what this model is saying is the same approach using hedging your instrument with a set of other instruments, but determining how many units or how much volume, what is the amount of contract you have to enter into. The determination is happening purely based on the historical data using the regression process, right? Rather than okay, at this in the earlier scenario, just to see here in this example, when we were doing the hedging, all we tried out initially was this particular, I mean, if I had to hedge this overall key rate 01, we identified the how much proportion of this has typically need to be long or short. So for that we have at this point, whatever was the proportion of these two is what we have taken and said 44.34% of longing you have to typically do. But what this model is saying is overall, overall historically, what are the yields associated with your hedging instrument, and what are the corresponding yields associated with the instrument with which the portfolio which needs to be hedged. You just try to frame a relationship between these two. You form a regression equation between these two, the hedged instrument versus the portfolio that needs to be hedged. The day on day basis, find out their yields, and based on that frame an equation which will determine how much worth of this has to be longed or shorted to hedge against this particular risk. So that is where we are bringing in the regression based hedge. So probably even if I am using, let's say I want to hedge my 20-year bond, 20-year maturity bond, right? I may use a combination of some 10-year bond, some 30-year bond, or probably some 5-year bond. I may use a combination of these three bonds to hedge the risk on this bond, right? Probably if the interest rates are because here we are talking of the interest rates falling at some point, growing at some point, right? So to observe that kind of scenario, what we are saying is we will try to hedge that 20-year bond with a combination of these. So how much has to go into each? As in the earlier also we have tried the same. One bond we wanted to hedge with a 2-year, 5-year, 10-year and 30-year zero coupon bond. Here also, let's say I want to hedge with these three. All what we are trying in this model is we are trying to build a relationship between the 20-year yields, historical 20-year yields versus 10-year, 30-year and 5-year kind of yield. When the yield was, well, today, what is the 20-year bond yield? What is the 5-year bond yield? What is the 10-year bond yield? What is the 30-year bond yield? Form a multiple regression kind of an equation. Take such data yesterday, day before yesterday, 1 month back, 10 months back, 5 years back. What were the historical numbers associated with the portfolio which you want to hedge versus the securities with which you want to hedge your portfolio with? That regression equation, whatever the coefficients that are derived for that regression equation, that is what is the weightages you are trying to give to each of the securities which you would like to invest. That is what we are calling as a empirical approach, because any empirical approach is where you derive the formula from the data, no scientific formula. By observing the various historical data, we are trying to draw the relationships between the left hand side and the right hand side. Because when we observed the DV01 position, we want it was typically talking of that all the yields will move parallelly itself, whether we are using the bond or portfolio which we want to hedge versus the instrument with which we are trying to hedge. All of them, it is assuming that the yields move in a very parallel kind of a direction, but which is not the reality at all. Sometimes what could happen is, if this is the kind of scenario we have, treasury bonds, if I am hedging them with inflation protected securities. See, even here also we have something called index linked bonds, inflation index. So what will happen for those kind of bonds is, based on the inflation, their face value can either go up or go down. The coupons can either go up or go down. When I talk about a treasury inflation protected securities, their their face value is automatically going up or going down with respect to inflation. But a treasury bond does not go up or go down, the face value does not change, which means when the interest rates go down, the price of the bond is going to go up, whereas when the interest rates are going to go up, the price of the bond is going to go down. But if I am trying to hedge that with this, if for a treasury inflation protected security, the price will not go up because face value is directly going up, so the price may still remain the same itself. So because of that, what is happening is, if this kind of hedging has to be done, then probably it does not give a proper hedging mechanism, because your treasury bond value may either go up or go down drastically, whereas tips, the price will not go up or go down drastically because your coupons and the face values are adjusted accordingly. So the price of it may not change that drastically. So that is where we are saying, what we can very well do when I have to do those kind of models is, you find out what is the change in the real yield versus the change in the nominal yield. So probably every month or every day, take what is the change in the real yield. Real yield is after removing the inflation factor, versus what is the change in the nominal yield. I can very well capture the data for long periods of time, build a regression model. So this is a change in real yield from last month to this month. This is a change in the nominal yield. So probably it could very well happen that last month the nominal yield is 8%, this month 9%. Whereas when I talk about the real yield, probably this could have been 2%. This also could have been 2%. Which means probably last month the inflation would have been around 6%. This month the inflation would have been around 7%. Because of that, the nominal yield is still increasing, but the real yield is not increasing. But if I am using tips, which is an inflation protected security, its interest rates will move like this, right? It is because it takes care of inflation. It takes care of inflation. So the real movement in the interest rate for it is only like this. Whereas your treasury bond, the movement is like this. Now these two are not a perfect hedge. These two are not a perfect hedge, because if there is an increase of 1% here, there is no increase there. So now what we are saying is, if at all I have to use a security Y as a hedge instrument for security X, I will have to look at not just on their nominal terms, I also have to look at on their real terms, because it may very well happen that one of them is more moving with respect to the real term, because one of them is impacted by inflation very heavily, the other is not that heavily impacted by inflation. Even if I look at a 5-year security versus a 10-year security, it may very much be possible that because of inflation, The 5-year security is getting impacted very drastically, but the 10-year security may not be impacted drastically. If that's the case, measuring on a real terms, not on the nominal terms, especially where the securities are already inflation adjusted, will give a better model in terms of how many units of one I have to use to hedge the other. And that is so that's where we are talking of using the regression based hedging. So there are two types which we talk about in regression based hedging. One, you take the changes. Both sides you take the changes only. Change in the yields of security 1 versus change in the yields of security 2. Do a modeling between the two. Do a regression model between the two, saying probably something like this. The change in the nominal rate of return versus the change in the real rate of return. We are talking of changes from last month to this month. What was the change in the nominal? What was the change in the real? It's a pure simple regression model. So what it is saying is probably for every 1% change in the real, or for every 1 unit change in the real interest rate, what is the change in the nominal interest rate that you are expecting? So if the real interest rate probably changes by 1%, this model may say that the nominal interest rate may change by 1.5% and so on. Based on this, you can find out, okay, if the hedging part I have to do for 2% of the nominal, then probably how many units of this treasury inflation protected securities I may have to long or short to protect against such kind of a movement. So the regression based model, and that too checking out on this beta, whichever is the coefficient of this regression based model, that will help us to identify what is the optimal number of longings or shortings I have to do to hedge my portfolio altogether. So that is where we are talking about when we are finding out the DV01 for security 1, or probably the nominal as well as the real. This will tell you if at all I have to hedge, let's say $1,000 of nominal. My portfolio is, let's say, $1,000. What we are saying is, this is the change DV01 of the nominal versus the DV01 of the real, which is nothing but probably if the risk of nominal is 2 units and if the risk of real is 1 unit, risk is nothing but for every 1% change, what is the change in the price, and multiplied by the beta factor. So what we are saying is, if at all $1,000 of the nominal portfolio has to be hedged, probably it is saying it's better that you go with $3,000 of the real portfolio, because the fluctuation in the real is much lesser compared to the fluctuation in the nominal. So if at all it is saying that DV01 of nominal is 2, DV01 of real is 1, DV01 is a measure of your interest rate fluctuation. So if the nominal rate is changed by 1%, what is the change in the price? Versus if the real rate is changed by 1%, what is the change in the price of the bond? Multiplied by the beta factor which has come out in the earlier scenario through the regression. So on that, what we are saying is, if at all I have to use a real security to hedge a nominal based like treasury bond is a nominal based bond, whereas tips is a real based bond. So if at all I have to hedge a treasury bond with tips, I have to go with 3 times the number of security, 3 times the worth of the portfolio, because I am getting the DV01 this as around 2 units and beta I have got as 1.5. So overall we are saying 3 times the face value of the nominal should be the face value of the real to offer a better hedging mechanism. And in this case, one thing is, this DV01 or beta or any of these things, we are computing at a point in time. Today, as of today, we are computing these kind of values. But what could very well happen is that values also could change over a period of time, right? So even from that case, again closing out some of the positions, adding a few more. Taking a hedging for entering into the futures market in the long position or short position for few more securities, or closing out the existing positions need to be done as a part of a dynamic hedging kind of a process. And how do I know the hedge is very effective? Again, using the same concept of regression, where you can look out for standard error and even R squared. If the R squared is very high in this regression model, then probably you are very well saying that using a real security, which is based on a real rate of return, for hedging a security based on a nominal rate of return, these two can very well be used for hedging purpose. You can very well hedge a nominal rate based security with a real rate based security. The same logic, if you are extending it to two variables, let's say you want to hedge a 20-year maturity bond using a 10-year maturity bond as well as a 30-year maturity bond. Again, the same logic we are following. We will observe over a period of time how the 20-year rates are changing. What is the change in a 20-year rate, probably on a monthly basis or whatever? What is the change in the 20-year rate? And also change in a corresponding 10-year rate and 30-year rates. So we are taking them as three different values, fitting a regression equation and identifying the values of this beta 10 and beta 30. So which will tell me that probably if a 10-year rate is changed by 1%, keeping everything else constant, what would be the change in the 20-year rate? Same way, beta 30 will tell me for if the 30-year rate is changed by 1%, keeping all others as constant, what would be the change in the 20-year rate? So when I am forming my portfolio or when I am forming my hedged portfolio, I can invest a B10 proportion in the 10-year security and B30 proportion in the 30-year security, so that the hedging becomes more and more appropriate. The only difference being, earlier scenario, we have formed these B10 and B30 using the error minimization kind of stuff, whereas for only one set of data. Whereas here, it is also error minimization kind of stuff, but using a set of historical data and applying a regression process. That's the only difference between the model which we have discussed in the multi-factor kind of scenario, where we have used the forward bucket 01 or key rate 01 kind of an approach, versus this model. Here we are not looking at one single value. We are observing the change in the 20-year rates over a long period versus the change in 10-year rates versus the change in 30-year rates, trying to find a regression equation between the two. And if the R squared is high, very high, what it means to me, this 20-year rate can very well be modeled using 10-year rate and 30-year rate, a combination of 10-year change and 30-year change. So if we are long on this part, see, even in the similar kind of a concept, probably if we have used in options under the call put parity relationship, when we said this, probably we said this is synthetic, S minus P minus X by E per RT, which means synthetically the price of the call should be equal to this value, the price of the stock minus the price of the put, blah blah blah, right? If these two are not equal, we said we can create an arbitrage. Here, how is the arbitrage getting created? Probably long on this, short on this, or short on this, long on this. The same logic if you think of here, if the 20-year bond can very well be represented by 10 years and 30 years, right? Can very well be represented based on 10 years and 20-year yield. All I am saying is if I am long on this, I'll go short on this combination, which will hedge my complete risk. If the R squared is very, very high, my hedging position is nothing but if I am long on this 20-year bond, I'll create a short portfolio on the combination of 10 and 30. But if the R squared is much lesser, then any combination will not give me a better hedging in this scenario. So that is what we are trying to do using a regression based hedging. We are observing the data. Either in this we are talking about two different, either I can take the changes over a period like last month to this month. What is the change in 20-year rate? What is the change in 10-year rate? What is the change in 30-year rate? Do a regression between them. And so the model that tells you is, okay, if the 10-year rate is going to change by 1% and 30-year rate is going to change by 2%, what would be the appropriate change in the 20-year rate? So, and I will create in such a way that if I am long on this position, I am short on this position, overall there is going to be a neutralization across. On the other side, if I am using a level based regression, we are not talking of the change, we are taking the interest rates in reality. Probably it's like, okay, 20-year rate is 8%, 10-year rate is 7%, 30-year rate is 9%. Tomorrow or probably the next month, this has become 8.5%, this has become 7.25%, and this has become 9.75%. So like this, with this data, we'll do the regression between this and this. So based on the equation that is going to come up and the R squared, if it is very, very high, I can use this equation very well to create a proper hedge for me using the coefficients which are derived for each of these expressions. So in this also, again, just like in our multiple correlation scenario, we may have the scenario of serial correlation also existing in your data, which means across time, the error term, I mean, as a part of one of the assumptions of the multiple regression, we have simply made that the error term should be independent of each other. But if the error term is dependent over time, if it is exhibiting some kind of pattern, then we are saying there is a serial correlation that is present in the data. And if there is a serial correlation, again we have come out with the mechanisms of how to identify the serial correlation and probably how to remove the serial correlation. So we have to remove all those things and based on that come out with a mechanism of what proportion should I invest in 10-year security versus a 30-year security to typically identify to what extent this 20-year security can very well be hedged. So the same hedging, if you are creating with the multiple securities, either you can use a duration and key rate 01 or key rate duration kind of an approach to create a hedged portfolio, or you can use this regression kind of a model to create a hedged portfolio. But in the end, these two models are directly targeting on, don't depend on one single factor called duration for the entire maturity period. Assume that there are non-parallel shifts and changes in the yield curves. Based on that, to create a better hedging scenario, you follow either an empirical based model or a key rate based model to arrive at the combinations that you need to invest in each of the securities. And yeah, now there could be a scenario. In the earlier example, we just looked at using a 10-year bond and a 30-year bond, right? But probably I can think of 20 such bond, 1-year bond, 2-year bond, 3-year bond, 20-year bond. I can use a combination of some 20, 30 bonds to hedge my 20-year security. See, there may be so many bonds that are available in the market. I may want to create a combination of all those bonds to hedge the portfolio which I have. If that's the case, how do I find out the coefficients of each of the ones? That is where the principal component analysis actually comes into picture. See, basically, we are talking of regression here. Regression means probably if my dependent variable, let's say, is a 20-year interest rate. I am trying to model, let's say, 1-year interest rate, 5-year interest rate, 10-year interest rate, 15-year interest rate, and probably 25-year interest rate. Let's say I am taking all these as independent variables because these are most commonly tradable bonds according to me. I want to hedge that particular bond's interest rate movement with a combination of all these bonds. Now, I am using regression. If I am using regression, what is the basic criteria of a regression? The independent variable should be independent. But there is a good possibility that these variables, if I am using, there could be a lot of interdependency between these independent variables itself, which is what we have already discussed earlier, the concept of multicollinearity. So this multicollinearity, because of this multicollinearity principle, what we have to typically do is remove the interdependency of these independent variables. This is addressed through a process called principal component analysis. Typically, the various statistical tools talk of a mechanism called factor analysis also, which is what internally they use a statistical concept called principal component analysis. See, otherwise, the typical mechanisms that are suggested, if there are 5 independent variables and they are interdependent, where multicollinearity exists, the common suggestion that is always given is remove one of the variables and rerun the regression equation. But that will result in a data loss, because you are removing one of the variables which may have at least slightest level of impact on the overall portfolio. So that is where the suggestion of principal component analysis that comes is, you club, instead of removing, you club 2 or more very closely related variables using an algorithm. And what it typically does is, by doing this clubbing process, it takes out all the commonality of various variables into one single component, and the remaining parts as other different components. Like that, it iterates the process. One component is commonality of all the variables. Second component is the remaining part of the commonality of all the variables. So in that exercise, what a principal component analysis does is, it clubs the commonality of all these 5 variables into one variable. One new variable is getting created. Instead of removing the variables, it is clubbing the variable. And because of that, what happens is, even though you have 20 independent variables, they get shortlisted to 3, 4 or 5 independent variables altogether, because there is a lot of clubbing that happens in an iterative fashion, wherein the 20 variables are clubbed together into 4 or 5 variables. So because of that, what is happening? The complexity is getting reduced, right? If there are 20 variables, in reality, you have to find out the correlations that are existing between the pairs of 20. So there are so many correlations that have to be computed. But if the number of variables are getting reduced to 4 or 5, the whole complexity of the analysis is completely getting reduced. So principal component analysis targets that particular aspect, wherein the whole set of variables are getting reduced into 3 or 4 kind of components. And what the other thing you observe is, if you look at the correlations between the various components, it will be very close to 0. If you look at the correlation between the components, probably I'll try executing that for you in some other tool. See, okay, if see, typically what happens is, let's say some simple data I take, and I want to find out the correlations between, let's say, all these various independent variables. Right? If I find out the correlations between all these independent variables, let's say all these various independent variables, if I want to try finding out the correlations between them, there are huge correlations that are existing, like 0.627, 0.84, 0.837, 0.69. There are a lot of huge positive correlations that are probably, let's assume that I am taking all these things as input variables to model something, to model the sales, to predict the sales. Let's say I am assuming all these things as the input factors. So as per the concept of regression, my independent variables should be independent. Whereas here the independent variables are not independent because we are seeing interdependence between them as the correlation numbers are much higher. So if I am doing a principal component analysis of all this, let's say here how many variables are there? 4, 5, 6, 7. There are so many independent variables. 8, 9, 10 variables are there. Apply the same to your the example which we have talked of. I want to model a 20-year bond with respect to 1 year, 2 year, 5 year, 10 year, 15 year. So these are all my independent variables. The yields of all those bonds are my various independent variables. There is a very big possibility that there could be a lot of interdependence like this between the independent variables. But if I am doing a kind of principal component analysis on these things, if I am doing a kind of principal component analysis on these things, so this is the method is the principal component analysis. If I am doing, what could very well happen is, you see that this entire thing is getting reduced only into two components. The total 9 variables are getting reduced into two components only, and you will find that the correlation between those two components, yeah, now these are the two components that are formed. Now if I try doing the correlation between those two components which are formed instead of all these, because that two are a reflection of all these 9 in some combination. What is that combination? These are the combinations. Probably the component 1 takes 61% of the price, 88.2% of engine size. So that is the weightages that it is giving to all these values, and finally formed one component. Similarly, the second component. These two, if I am looking at the interdependence between these two components, if I am looking at the interdependence, I think I did not save those things. Let me just do that. Okay. It is forming two components. You see the interdependence now, the correlation between the two components that got formed. The correlations are 0. Between 1 and 2, the correlation is 0, which means now these two independent variables are really independent. It will make the factor analysis or principal component analysis. What it does is, even though you have 9 variables overall, it has reduced them to 2 or 3 variables which are really independent, and there is no interdependency that is existing between them. So as a part of your model, as a part of your model, as a part of predicting or linking the 20-year rate with these various maturity interest rate, if this is the kind of equation you are building, removing the interdependency between the various independent variables, the result will be more and more effective, because even if there is a change in one of the variables, because of this multicollinearity, the result will not get biased. So we have to make sure that every time we are applying a regression, this we have discussed even in our regression chapter also, every time we apply a regression, we have to make sure that the independent variables are really independent and no interdependency exists between them. So as in a nutshell, in this chapter, the focus is on modeling your modeling the interest rates or the yields on your portfolio with respect to the yields on some other securities with which you want to hedge. Instead of using a duration or a key rate based hedging mechanism, we are talking about a regression based hedging mechanism where we consider these rates over historical period and trying to map using a regression equation the relationships between the two rates.